Hello, I'm David Patterson from Deutsche Bank, and welcome to this session on swap-based ETFs. At Deutsche Bank, I'm responsible for the distribution to the IFA and platform channel of our range of exchange-traded funds known as DBX trackers, as well as a range of exchange-traded commodities known under the DBETC banner. But in this presentation, today what we're going to look at is exactly how swap-based ETFs work, what you need to understand in terms of their structure and construction, why they become so popular, and also we'll address the issues of counterparty exposure and look at what swap-based ETF providers have done to address this so that you can feel comfortable and confident in recommending these products to your clients. And in case you're wondering about the imagery that you see on the slide behind you, all we're attempting to convey with this particular imagery is that ETFs in themselves are highly liquid, highly transparent carriers in which you can hold just about any asset from any sector or any theme, any country, or any index. And indeed, one of the key reasons for the success and flexibility of swap-based ETFs is the ability for them to be able to hold any conceivable asset class. At DBX Trackers, the business has been going just over 4 years. It was launched in January 2007, and we now cover pretty well the whole range of asset classes, including some innovative asset classes and areas such as hedge fund ETFs, currency, and commodity products. We currently have nearly 32 billion sterling under management, and we're currently the third largest provider in Europe. One of the key things about all ETFs from Deutsche Bank, it's important to recognize for most ETFs as well, is that they all satisfy the respective reporting fund requirements or distributor status requirements. This is critical as far as ensuring that any gain that you make is treated for capital gains tax purposes. Now, the case for swap-based ETFs, essentially there are really only 3 things you need to take away from this presentation. The first is that swap-based ETFs provide perfect index tracking. The second is that there is a broad range of asset classes available to you using swap-based ETFs. And finally, there is this issue of counterparty exposure, and we'll look at how swap-based ETFs address this, and in certain cases can actually overcome and mitigate this. To understand the development of swap-based ETFs, you need to understand the development of UCITS and the most recent generation of UCITS, which came into being in 2001-2002, the UCITS 3, third generation version of UCITS. Swap-based ETFs effectively only began when UCITS allowed the introduction and the use of derivatives under this particular directive. The physical or partial or direct replication structure has been around for some time, but swap-based ETFs came into being literally from about 2001 onwards. The key difference between a swap-based ETF and a physical direct replication ETF is that the swap-based ETF delivers perfect index tracking back to the ETF by holding a basket of securities plus an index return swap. It does give you access to a far greater variety of indices and asset classes, as we'll look at a bit later. Perhaps the best way to understand the difference between a physical and swap-based ETF structure is to consider how the ETFs themselves actually try to track and follow an index. Now, if we consider in this particular example, which is hypothetical, the performance of this index that we're looking at tracking is this solid blue line. The index is tracking perfectly upwards from bottom left to top right. And to deliver perfect index tracking, the ideal situation would be to be on this solid line. The performance, however, that you will get from a swap-based ETF is this perfect index tracking. The only deviation away from the perfect solid line is caused by the impact of the all-in fee, or the total expense ratio. So your worst case situation for a swap-based ETF is to be on this dotted line. But in actual fact, in some cases, it's possible to be even above the dotted line. And when we think about a physical replication ETF, the performance of a physical replication ETF can be somewhat more erratic. The reason for this is largely due to the introduction of real-world factors. An ETF trying to track on a physical basis an index which is very broadly diversified can find it particularly difficult in terms of holding all the securities in an index, in terms of the timing differences of dividends, corporate actions, and other events. And therefore you can get a somewhat erratic degree of underperformance from the perfect index tracking. And as such, with certain physical replication ETFs, there can be an inconsistent and unstable tracking performance. And we'll look at some real examples in a minute of how this actually happens. With a physical replication ETF, it's fairly straightforward to understand that in this particular example, the FTSE 100 ETF, a physical or direct replication ETF will hold all the underlying securities in the index and will pass back on occasion to that ETF any potential enhancements. However, when you're trying to replicate on a physical basis very broadly diversified indices, such as the MSCI World, the FTSE All-Share, or in this particular case, the MSCI Emerging Market Index, you can run into difficulty in terms of incurring additional costs. In many cases, you have timing differences of markets actually not being physically open. In some cases, you actually have foreign ownership restrictions. So in this particular type of structure, a physical replication ETF quite often does not hold all the underlying securities and holds purely a representative basket of securities. In addition which, it will also hold other instruments such as ADRs, other ETFs in fact, equity-linked notes and certificates. So don't assume always that a physical replication is physically holding all the underlying securities. Now we think back to the original example about the hypothetical index. We look at a real example here of an index such as the MSCI Emerging Market Index being tracked. And what we're showing here is the index on a relative basis. That's the horizontal line. We're showing the performance of the DBX Trackers ETF, tracking this index, tracking the index perfectly. The only deviation away from the index is the impact of the fee. But below that, you'll see a very unstable tracking performance from a direct replication ETF tracking the exact same index. Now, this is actually the world's largest emerging market ETF tracking this index. And as you can see, it exhibits very unstable performance. And the reasons are that in America, where this ETF is actually based, they do not have the capability to use the index swap, the efficient structure that we have over here. And as I just mentioned, one of the key differences about trying to track markets on a physical basis, particularly ones that are broadly diversified and made up of a number of different countries, is the timing difference. The actual markets themselves, in many cases, will be closed when our ETFs are trading on the London Stock Exchange and our markets are open, as represented by these solid green bars. You can see where there potentially are timing differences. And this all leads to the potential for tracking error and tracking difference. Now, we're looking at exactly the same index here. This is the MSCI Emerging Market Index, shown on a relative basis against our own ETF on the blue line. But if you consider also the performance and reason why you should look at ETFs in themselves, this is actually a study done by Bloomberg of all the actively managed emerging market funds in Europe. This is over 121 individual funds. And as you can see, the composite performance of all of these funds themselves have underperformed the market themselves. So this is a very strong case for the use of ETFs in any portfolio, and a good case of where active funds can sometimes fail to actually deliver the performance of the index itself.